Okay, and then the questions, I strongly encourage you to hold your questions until I open actually the floor. Basically, I think we are going to start discussion within the panel. After then, I'm going to open the panel to the floor. So having said that, let me introduce our speakers and the panelists. Actually, the detailed bio of each panelist and the speakers are available in the conference brochure. So I briefly introduced each panelist. The first speaker is Mr. Alexander Sejert. Please join me in welcoming him. Mr. Alexander Sejar is the Executive Secretary, Cybercrime Convention Committee, and the head of the Cybercrime Program Office, Council of Europe. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming. The second speaker is Mr. Glenn Lewis. Welcome, Glenn Lewis. Mr. Lewis is a Director, National Coordinator, Cybercrime Operations in the Australian Federal Police. He used to be seconded to Interpol, my former colleague. Welcome to Japan and welcome to the cybercrime session. The third speaker is General Michael Flynn. Welcome, welcome, General. Former Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA, United States. The next speaker is Mr. Paul Ward. Paul, welcome. The Cyber Intelligence Manager, National Crime Agency of the United Kingdom. The last but not least, the next speaker is Mr. Shirai Toshiaki. Thank you for coming here. The Director for Cyber Security, Commissioner General Secretariat, National Police Agency of Japan. Thank you so much for the coming today. Well, it is actually my great pleasure to moderate the first session of the cybercrime track, which is a global law enforcement effort to combat cybercrime. I hope that the audience, you will enjoy each of the three sessions, starting this session, and then enrich our discussion, by your active participation. This 90 minutes session is designed to discuss the effort law enforcement have made to deal with cybercrime and to identify major challenges or obstacles to attribute criminals, and what kind of the collaboration is needed for law enforcement to make their investigation more successful. So we will discuss those issues based on the reality, which is different from one country to another. And we have to respect it, we have to recognize it. In this context, we will first hear from our speakers the current situation on the harmonization of legislative framework to combat cybercrime on the global level. Cybercrime is a transnational crime in nature, so we need a global coordination. So, and also the legal framework is fundamentally important for law enforcement to combat cybercrime. Without appropriate legislative framework, police cannot bring criminals into justice. So after this presentation, our four panelists will be speaking about their country's situation, country's experience to deal with cybercrime with specific focus on the legal, operational, and or technical aspect. The prerequisite of our discussion is actually the criminal groups now find out cybercrimes produce high profit with low risk of being arrested, number one. Number two is that cybercrime is now increasingly industrialized. So the threat level is very high, and the cybercrime as a service is now available online black market, so-called darknet, at affordable price. In short, the current situation environment is very challenging for law enforcement to identify and arrest criminals across the national border. Having said that, I would like to give floor to Alexander Sejar. Thank you. You have the floor.
Thank you. Good morning. A great pleasure to be here in a wonderful setting. I think of the past 500 events I participated or so, this must be probably the top setting for conferences. And I really appreciate that you're here and not on the beach. cybercrime is a matter of perspective, and I of course look at it from the Council of Europe perspective. The Council of Europe is an organization with 47 member states. It's not the European Union, it's larger in membership, older, but also poorer in many ways than the European Union. And the Council of Europe is aimed at promoting human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. So if we look at cybercrime as an issue, we look at cybercrime as a threat to these core values. And we look at measures to prevent and control cybercrime as a way to protect, to allow governments to meet their positive obligation to protect society individuals against crime, and when doing so, respecting rule of law standards. We had a large conference in Strasbourg in June, the Octopus Conference, and we asked the question, we did a survey among the 300 or so cybercrime experts from around the world, government and private sector, of whether they believed that governments are able to protect the rule of law in cyberspace. Is the rule of law in cyberspace? Are offenders brought to justice? Or is crime the rule, and is it a rule that offenders go free? And a score from 1 to 10, 10 being there is absolute safety in cyberspace, and crime is the exception, to 1, there is basically no rule of law. I think the average was around 3, which means that there is a huge doubt that rule of law, there's rule of law in cyberspace. So let's look at what we have, what we can build upon, and what are the challenges. One thing we can build upon is indeed the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime, which next year will have its 15th anniversary. And Japan is a party to that convention also, which shows that also as Council of Europe, we're not limiting ourselves to the 47 European countries, but we work with any country around the world, given that cybercrime and electronic evidence is basically global. And here's one thing we have to keep in mind. We are not just looking at cybercrime as offenses against and by means of computers. We need to look at also electronic evidence in relation to any crime found on computer systems and how to access such data for criminal justice purposes. So we have the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime. About 1/3 of global states, 66 countries, are either parties or signatories to that treaty. That one is backed up, and it functions very well. It has led to a harmonization of legislation. In addition to those 66 states that are parties or signatories, we have at least another 66 states that have used it as a guideline for domestic legislation. So it's indeed the global norm for cybercrime legislation. It's backed up by the Cybercrime Convention Committee, which is the committee of the parties that assesses the actual implementation. So we're not satisfied that somebody signs up to the treaty. We also want to check, is a state really implementing it, applying it in practice? So through that Cybercrime Convention Committee, we enhance the quality of implementation by the party. And finally, this whole thing is backed up by capacity building programs in order to enable countries to implement it in practice, also to prepare new countries to join this convention in the future, because we want to have any new party to be able to apply it in practice. We're not interested in numbers. We want quality members to join. So this is functioning very well. We also, for the capacity building side, we established last year a specific office in Romania, from where we're now implementing all our global capacity building activities. And this triangle of a convention, a follow-up committee, and capacity building, this dynamic triangle is functioning very well, and it's something we can bank upon. Keep in mind, it is nowadays almost impossible to negotiate any new international treaty on cybercrime. And even the Budapest Convention today could not be negotiated anymore. I don't think we would find common agreement or agreement and consensus on a new type of convention, which means the best of it, it's there. It's in place and it's functioning. We can bank on that. Now, the core challenge, as we see it, is how to ensure efficient access to electronic evidence for criminal justice purposes while respecting rule of law safeguards. What we need internationally is more efficient police-to-police cooperation, but also mutual legal assistance. And there has been, over a 2-3 year period, a detailed analysis done by the Cybercrime Committee on the functioning of mutual legal assistance. And the result adopted in December last year is a set of recommendations that can make the whole process more efficient. Most of it it's just a question of resources and skills. It doesn't require new treaties. A lot of it can be done like multi-language templates for requests and that sort of things, training. A lot of it can be done if resources are available. The second thing is we need, beyond possibly the Budapest Convention, additional solutions for law enforcement access to data in the cloud. Because what we have is electronic evidence or data, and therefore electronic evidence needed, is somewhere on servers, probably in foreign jurisdiction, in unknown jurisdiction, in multiple jurisdictions at the same time. How do you access this? What rule applies? I think there's some interesting cases right now discussed internationally. There is in Belgium the Yahoo case, there is the Microsoft Ireland case. There are many of these cases that we are waiting for final results after appeals to see what the outcome is. But probably we may need to work towards a protocol to the Budapest Convention. Ideally, something like this is negotiated at United Nations level, but that's not feasible. You could say, from a European Union perspective, they may think about a European Union-US agreement, but that would lead off Japan and Canada and many other countries, actually any other country except the EU and US. So the most likely scenario is if it is possible to negotiate an international legal framework, it would be probably through a protocol to the Budapest Convention. And also, we need to make sure that rules regarding access to data meet rule of law and privacy standards. And therefore, we may also see whether an exception to data protection rules permitting law enforcement access to data and sharing of data between states and also between public and private sectors should also possibly be in the form of a protocol to the Budapest Convention. So that's it for the moment.
Thank you, Alexander, for your informative information. I'd like to ask a couple of questions. I think that's your update is very useful and helpful for the panelists and the audience to understand the current harmonization status of the legislative measures taken by law enforcement of the government. So would you be able to tell us what is working, what is not, in terms of the Cybercrime Convention? Because I'm asking this question, for instance, China, India, Brazil, Russia, they are not a part of the Budapest Convention. So could you share your view on this?
As I mentioned before that you have 66 plus 66, if we take roughly these figures, which makes 2/3 of the states worldwide have used the Budapest Convention already as a guideline. We have worked closely with India in 2007 and 2008, and the amendments to the Information Technology Act adopted in December 2008 of India brought the legal framework of India broadly in line with the Budapest Convention. So one would have to check the implementing regulations to what extent they are compatible in detail, but broadly the framework is in place. My understanding is the Parliament of Brazil has right now amendments to the criminal code in Parliament, and again, largely based on the Budapest Convention. So even countries that have not joined yet are using that treaty. And my understanding is also that the authorities of China and others are also looking at the treaty. We work really with any countries. I mean, I cannot say now because we provide advice on a confidential basis, but we have at any time multiple countries whose laws, draft laws or existing laws we are analyzing. So on the legal side, I don't see the real issue, in particular when it comes to substantive law, meaning what do we define as a criminal offense? I think there is a lot of agreement on that. The issue is the procedural law rules. And it's very difficult for parliaments to push changes of procedural law through their parliaments, giving law enforcement additional powers. That's really problematic. And therefore, that's the challenge, and the big challenge is really rule of law safeguards. What protections do you have? And here we have another, related challenge to is this confusion between national security measures and criminal justice measures. So what you have, the public mistrusts government anywhere in the world these days because of mass surveillance and other reports and activities, not just the reporting, but the actual activities. And the result is, because it's difficult to put additional rules there for national security institutions, additional rules and obstacles are put there for criminal justice institutions. A further result of that is more and more of the actual powers are shifting from criminal justice to national security, which in turn then reduces rule of law safeguards and so on. So that's a very dangerous trend in my opinion.
Thank you so much. I think that you have touch upon two very important things. One is the cloud, and then that is somehow related to the geolocalization of the data, which we will revisit later on. And also you mentioned that the criminal justice and the national security. Actually, just for your information, that the Interpol categorizes the cyber attacks, which we often use this word, cyber attacks, into three categories. One is that the online criminals, they work for money. The second is that the hacktivists, they don't work for money, but they target the government and the companies to express opinions and the protest. Third one is that nation state, which is involved in cyber espionage, which we believe is outside of criminal justice. It's a matter of national security most of the times. But I think that's we can discuss after actually the full panelist presentation. But actually, before moving to the, maybe I think you want to say?
I think in any country, espionage is a crime. I think we have to be clear on that. There is no international customary law allowing espionage. And in every domestic legislation, espionage is a crime. And I think the question, of course, to what extent can, as criminal justice institutions, can you prosecute and investigate that? At what stage do you then get a stop to it for political reasons and political considerations? But I think as a starting point, well, an intrusion, doesn't matter whether it's criminal or foreign governments, is a crime.
Yeah, that's true. So from the substantial laws perspective, that is actually the crime. I think espionage is crime, but I think I'm talking about it from the solution perspective. We are not able to the countries to arrest the country's man if they commit their crimes by themselves. I think asking thieves to catch the thieves, it's impossible. So that is why I mentioned it. But if there is any actually questions from the actually the panelists, maybe I think we can go. Yeah,
is
please.
that okay? Yeah, can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, so we got the discussion right now is very legalistic. And I think what we have to recognize is that there is international law, and then there's which is known, it has been decided upon, and then there's international behavior that we may respect the sovereignty of another country, but do we accept the behavior of a nation state that not only violates and attacks the national security of other nations, but also supports and enables crime? And if we know that crime is occurring, international crime against our financial systems, against our telecommunication systems, we know that is occurring on somebody or from somebody else's soil, another nation state, and it's affecting our national security. Is it illegal? Is it a national security issue? Is it acceptable? The challenge that we're facing today is this sort of dynamic between international law, which rule of law is 60 nations or so. If there's only 60 nations, there's a lot of nations that did not support the Budapest. They didn't participate in it. So therefore, despite what they're doing, they have yet to actually accept international law in some cases. They certainly don't respect certain elements of it because we know their behavior is not appropriate. And so I think that's part of what we have to understand is that there are nation states that are conducting criminal activity through non-nation state actors that are part of their structure, part of their national security system to benefit themselves and other countries, some in this neighborhood. So I think we also have to come away from here with what is internationally accepted behavior, not just what is in law. If it's not accepted behavior, then we need to fix the law. We need to change the law. And we need to expose those organizations, those countries that are not acting in an internationally acceptable way in terms of the behavior that they're demonstrating.
I think that's very important point. I think the role of non-state actors something we need to bear in mind. I think that the currently the criminal justice system is based on nation state, as you mentioned. The threat we are facing the global. So I think that the policing, I have to mention the policing or law enforcement does not inherently the scalability across national border. So policing does not have scalability in cyberspace either. That is very challenging. But I think that's now I think that I'm going to invite actually each speaker to share national experience to deal with cyber. Once again, the cyber threats are global, but I think that based on the law enforcement, which is the matter of sovereignty, they are tackling this issue. And then I'm going to revisit the issue of non-state actors, because I think that is one of the complex issues which need to tackle. So I'd like to first invite the Glenn to share your country's experience. Yeah, you have the floor, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. Thanks, Nabiru. Look, it's a pleasure to be here, and I thank the Japanese government for inviting me. It's certainly a different role than I had recently at Interpol, very much focused on technology-enabled crime, but now in the federal police looking very much at pure cybercrime. Also, it takes note that Australia is a signatory to the Budapest Convention as a third-party state, and we changed our legislation in 2012 in requirements in harmonising our legislation with the recommendations from the convention. So what I wanted to talk about was basically some of the trends that we're seeing in Australia, our response both nationally and internationally. And I thought the point that was raised then and your discussion just before was interesting to me, because it's very hard for us at times to delineate between what is criminal activity and whether it's state-sponsored. And it's particularly difficult for Australia because we find that many of our suspects are actually offshore. So we're actually the recipients of the crimes offshore, and then we get into the space of mutual assistance and other things. But basically, in Australia's context, we're increasingly seeing sophisticated attacks, and they're a constant threat. Some of them are becoming advanced and persistent in nature. That's definitely what I saw today in East Asia, or what was reflected in the presentations. So it's very much our experience as well. Obviously, one of the main threats we're dealing with at the moment is financially motivated crime syndicates. We're at the moment dealing very particularly at this very point with a mass amount of spam email, both against government and private individuals, with a Drydex payload. And I think it's unprecedented, Australia and Australians being attacked the way they are being attacked only just in the last 24, 48 hours. And I think we found that that's quite unique to Australia at the moment. We're also seeing our financial services more generally being attacked. So last year we saw our superannuation firms being attacked. Now we're seeing human resource software providers that aren't as target hardened experiencing the same issues. Some of them also providing payroll cloud services. And there we've had 2 or 3 recent attacks which are really challenging us. The offenders are issue motivated, they're organised crime syndicates, and some are state and non-state sponsored actors. Our intelligence is pointing towards an increase in the dissemination of malware developed by these criminal groups. We're seeing an increase in these types of attacks against higher value targets, as these syndicates obviously chase the higher returns. And as again, I can talk about some case studies later, but it's been very hard for us to delineate whether they are state-sponsored or otherwise. As I said before, it's obviously very difficult for us to actually identify some of the individuals at the centre of these attacks to get the sufficient evidence because a lot of it's offshore. We also have many cases of ransomware, romanceware, sextortion, revenge porn, heavily reported in Australia, as you'd imagine. The government agencies responsible for cyber security see broad-based and targeted attacks also by hacktivists. So that's the current environment, and it seems similar to what other countries are experiencing, so it's nice to know we're not unique. Our response, we employ a range of non-traditional and traditional strategies. Cybercrime investigations differs from our partner agencies who focus on the cyber security space. As I said, we're very much focused on the pure cyber in the Australian Federal Police. So we're obviously focused on, DDoS attacks, breaches of major computer systems, collective large-scale breaches to harvest personnel, business and/or financial data. As I said before, that's something we're very much experiencing at the moment, even to the point where our government website, which is called MyGov, which provides a bunch of services to members of Australia, the Australian community, using those credentials to actually put in false tax returns and obviously try and glean money off the Australian government. Cyber security probably not well thought out prior to that launch of that system. As far as the AFP is concerned, we have a very modest capability. We have 35 investigators and technical experts. We have teams in Canberra, Sydney and Melbourne, and they're my purview of responsibility. But we also work with our New Zealand partners, and we also have state and territory police. So we have an approach where we together collectively agreed to 3 tiers of training. What we see we need to do in Australia is, although we are reasonably good at this, our police officers right down to the front line need to be given better capability to actually respond. So we have 3 tiers of training, right at the recruit level, where we have online training and then face-to-face training, and on the job training. We have tier 2 training, which we are doing, for example, next week. We're working with our partners, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and we're trying to increase the capability of our investigators, those that come to work in our cybercrime operations. And then we have tier 3, which is very much a little bit more ad hoc. As we know, the cyberspace is wide and very deep, and we can't actually give our investigators all the capabilities and skills, the tools to actually confront cybercrime themselves. We have to have a multidisciplinary approach, and we have to have expertise in different areas, such as the operating systems and the networks. So we look at actually, for those investigators in our teams, we look at looking at very specialised areas, whether it be postgraduate or through organisations such as the SANS. So we have a multifaceted response, and I think this is what's interesting for us. It seems similar in some respects to what I heard this morning. This year we established the Australian Cyber Security Centre, and it brings a whole bunch of government agencies together and trying to delineate some of these issues we talked about, whether it's state-sponsored or just a criminal group activity. It's working to achieve basically an operational response, a whole-of-government response to cyber security incidents with industry, because the industry as well. We organise national cyber security operations and resources in that regard. We encourage and receive reporting of cyber security elements. So CERT Australia is a member of the ACSC, and we also chair the Asia Pacific CERT at the moment. So our collective activities in that group is very important. Also, interesting enough, last year we established the Australian Cybercrime Online Reporting Network, and that was an Australian policing initiative, the Australian Police, State and Territories. And basically it provides a platform for anyone in the community to report incidences of cybercrime, giving us an ability not only to actually measure it to a degree, but also provide some targeted educational advice. What we're generally finding, and I think this is probably common to many countries, is that cyber hygiene for many of our country people is not particularly good. Just basically antiviruses, password access, and obviously a lot of them are actually often the recipients or on the bad end of a spear phishing campaign. So to complement all of that, and given the Budapest Convention has its membership, but those that actually aren't members, we obviously work also with our network. So we have 100 police officers in 28 countries, in 35 locations around the world. We facilitate the exchange of information with foreign law enforcement on a range of crime matters. Now, obviously, we know that mutual assistance is a slow process. We know that it's too slow for us to actually have an impact, so we look at disruption. So we look at sharing information, like particular malware and others. As long as it doesn't have source information and personal data, we will push that out the door very quickly to alert other countries. what we are experiencing in Australia, what we think is a bit of a hothouse, a bit of a test bed for new malware and new ways of actually committing cybercrime. And then we're seeing that go offshore. So it's important that we share that information offshore. And obviously, in doing that, we obviously have a network of the networks, the alliance of the alliances, so to speak. So we're very, very supportive of the Interpol Global Complex of Innovation, of Interpol. We think that it's unique. It has tremendous potential. We also have someone in the NCFTA in Pittsburgh, and we know that they've got very, very good ability to decode malware. So we shifted offshore pretty quickly. The stuff that we get from the sophisticated intrusions into our financial system, our banks, we put that offshore very quickly as long as it's got no personal data. So that's how we do it. But we've also got people in Indonesia that support to Southeast Asia and capacity development and training. We're soon to put a cyber LO into Washington to better work with all the cyber centres there. So in short, that's our approach. It's both national, international, and
Thank you, Grant, for your addressing the cyber threat. Also, I think the finishing your presentation with a little bit of compliment on the Interpol Global Complex Innovation, IGCI. I have just one question for you. Actually, the Australian Federal Police is one of the Five Eyes countries: US, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and the UK. So they have their own handling code of information sharing. I think that in the morning session, lady mentioned Five Eyes issues. So what is your experience to actually the share information, especially sensitive information, amongst the Five Eyes and then with non-Five Eyes countries? Is there any particular difference, or is there any actually the particular threshold in terms of the scope of information, sensitivities of information?
look, I think a lot of the work we do in the Five Eyes space relates to, in our experience, state-sponsored actors. But if it's relating to a particular piece of malware or activities that impact on financial integrity of countries, we share that irrespective of the discussions that we would have in that forum. But what I will say, and I said it before, we have an alliance of the alliances. The Five Eyes law enforcement group is just one pillar. Now, there's a lot of mystique around that group, but it's no different than bilateral relationships that any country has with other countries. It complements what we do, but it is not front and centre of our strategy. Our strategy in this space is very much having to look at where we can work with EC3, the IGCI. Obviously, what's happening in the US with their centres is critical and important. For us particularly, because of the incredible capability, the Secret Service and also the FBI, but and also obviously we extend through the GCHQ. There's a really strong capability that we need to counter a crime.
Thank you for the dispelling some sort of the myth of the Five Eyes, because I had the privilege to participate in the Five Eyes cyber working group a couple of times. It's not the mysterious, but I think that they have the very friendly discussion of the cyber threat, especially advanced persistent threat, including nation-state sponsored threat. I think it was very good actually meeting for me to learn. Actually, I learned a lot, and then that should be, I think that's available to other actually the community as well. Having said that, I'd like to ask the General Flynn to share your views on the information sharing, the threat intelligence related thing, especially between law enforcement and military intelligence, because most of the times I think that military excels in gathering intelligence, not only, the cyber, but also physical one, compared with the ability of law enforcement. So you have the floor.
Yeah, great. And again, thank you for the invite. And I want to point out Adobe here, who I have a relationship with, but also for what they have done for our systems back in the United States. So why a military intelligence guy sitting up on this panel today? And what has changed, because I will address Five Eyes here in a second, because Five Eyes is an old model. It's a 20th century model. And so we need new 21st century models. So there's a big change that has fundamentally occurred between law enforcement and intelligence and military, because just as we've been talking about up here and as you've heard this morning, there's this blending or coming together of crime and national security problems. Because if transnational organized crime is stealing or a cancer inside of your financial system in the country of Japan, and it could cause your financial system to be challenged financially or in other ways, does that affect your national security? And the answer is that it absolutely does. I mean, if somebody yesterday or the last 48 hours, your Olympic Committee website in Japan was shut down for 12 hours. Most people probably don't even know that here. It was attacked for 12 hours, a denial of service. Why? Why was it attacked for 12 hours? Why was it shut down? Is that a national security issue? Is it a criminal issue? It's probably a little bit of both. It's a little bit of both. You know, and I can sit up here and I'm going to talk through why the importance of what Nobu has talked about with this interaction between military, law enforcement, and specifically intelligence. One of the broad statements is that law enforcement in the past, really prior, and the police officers up here they may disagree, and that's okay. But in the past, law enforcement was typically reactive. A crime occurred, and then we tried to figure out what happened. Okay? And that has had to change, because the crimes that are occurring today are so dramatic, particularly when it comes to cybercrime. The amount of money that is moving globally in the gray and the dark web world is in the hundreds of billions of dollars annually. Hundreds of billions of dollars annually. So the real threat, you know, it's not the countries in the neighborhood, you know, and I could lay those out, or it's not some of these other countries in other parts of the world, let's say the Middle East, that are sponsoring non-state actors. The greatest threat is complacency. That's the greatest threat. It's complacency and thinking that you as a nation or you as an organization, nobody's gonna attack me. And I don't think that that's necessarily the case, and it's certainly, I see it changing, because the second greatest threat, other than being complacent, is not being prepared. And that's, I think that the framework of this C3 conference is really to talk about how do we understand how we are preparing ourselves to take on something that is dramatically changing the world. It is dramatically changing the world. And I'll give you an example, a specific example of what our FBI in the United States is dealing with. And maybe some of these other countries are dealing with it. We now have people's data being taken hostage. Okay, so your data is being taken hostage. And you have criminals that are saying if you want your data back, it'll cost you money to get your data retrieved. Okay, the average price of the cost of that retrieval is $50,000, 50,000 US dollars. It's a big, big problem, and our FBI is dealing with it, and we're not sure it's just inside of the United States or it's overseas. So our intelligence community, which typically takes care of our international problems, the national security problems, are now dealing with our FBI, which is actually a large intelligence agency in and of itself, and they're one of our largest in the United States. The FBI is in 83 countries. The organization that I led was in 142 countries. And we're dealing with not only national security issues, but we're dealing with high crime. So the payment of the $50,000 is not in dollars. It's not in currency that you would imagine going to somebody's bank account. It's in Bitcoin. It's in Bitcoin. So this is in the last probably 2 or 3 years. So that's an example of people, and I can tell you, CEOs and other people who are trying to protect their data are having to change their entire lifestyle in order to do this. So talk about security and securing yourself. The problem is when an attack occurs, and this happens in our country a lot, happens in the United States a lot. Last year, in fact, in 2014, our FBI had to go notify just over 4,000 businesses to let them know that they had been breached and they had lost data through a cyber breach and essentially a theft of data and a theft in some cases, money, especially our banking systems. They didn't even know. They didn't even know. The problem that exists in the critical infrastructure world, okay, and I just in general, critical infrastructure in general globally is about 80% in the private market. Maybe 20% in our country. We're about 18% in government, and 82% critical infrastructure is in private sector. And the private sector, when they get attacked, they don't even know who to call. So this collaboration that has to occur amongst organizations today and amongst the international community, and that's why I say when I think about the Five Eyes Club, which is really a post World War II society, sort of a white glove society that's long past, and we have to begin to look at how do we share information far differently in these, certainly in a multilateral way. When it comes to crime, the law enforcement community, my experience in a variety of jobs, my experience is when it comes to crime, the International Criminal Consortium or the Anti-Criminal Consortium led by Interpol actually does a very effective job of sharing information to get the bad guys. When it comes to this blending of crime and national security issues, countries have a very difficult time working together because it falls back on intelligence and it falls back on national security and sovereignty, yet it's still, in many cases, it's criminal activity. It's criminal behavior that we have to either say it's acceptable or not acceptable, and obviously it's not acceptable. And the last point I'd make is in cybercrime. Okay, and I'll try to be very simple about this. Cybercrime, it's like all of us are sitting on our front lawn. We have all of our windows and our doors opened up, and we've said to the criminal, "Come on in, take everything you want, and go home with it. Go sell it on the market somewhere," because that's how blatant, that's how visible the cyber crime is happening today. Despite all of the firewalls, all of the secure mechanisms that we put into place, all of the policies we put in place, all of the training we do for people, we are allowing cyber crime to happen on a scale. And I said this the other day, and because it's some estimates, and the estimates actually range, but the high estimate last year for the cost of cyber crime and cyber threats last year globally the high was $3 trillion. Okay, $3 trillion. That's about 5, maybe 7% of the sort of the global currency, which is at about $60 trillion. So it's an amazing amount of money. So we have to figure out ways to work together much differently. We have to create new models. We have to definitely invest in capacity. I mean, what Australia just talked about gave you some great numbers. Glenn gave you some great numbers about what they're doing. And I know in our case, we're looking at over the next 10 years in the United States alone, growing a workforce of about 700,000. And so we're starting in earnest to prepare ourselves through all kinds of cyber training and cyber initiatives to be able to do this. So, I mean, these are just some of the things that I think we have to be thinking about. So, Nobu, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you so much, General Flynn. I think that's you mentioned that the data is taken hostage in the United States. We call it ransomware. And that is happening in Europe and then even Singapore. I think that here in Japan too. And then we have observed in some cases that actually the hostage taker demands a Bitcoin as ransom. So I think we need to actually we need to come up with a solution to track down criminals in the digital, I would say, tracking way. Unless otherwise, the Bitcoin is decentralized solution to transfer money. So it's not easy to identify who is asking money to you. I think that is one issue. But I think that thank you so much for your sharing your views on the information sharing and also the crime threat. I would say that the criminality is now shifting from the physical to the cyberspace. So I think the next speaker, I think Paul, I would like to ask you to share actually your country's experience. How does law enforcement shift or adapt the strategy to deal with the crime trends from physical to cyberspace? Yes, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Noboru, and I'd like to thank the government of Japan for inviting me here to speak. I can only echo the comments of my colleagues sat around the screens here in that the experiences that the United Kingdom has mirrors very much what my colleagues in different nations experience. When you boil it down, somebody's trying to steal something, somebody's trying to break something, or someone's trying to take something that's valuable to you and extort you. That is the majority of cybercrime. And criminals will find ever new novel ways to try and use those three elements to their benefit. The UK recognises that the internet is a fantastic medium for growth, for business, for society, but unfortunately it's also a fantastic medium for crime, and we have to make sure that we put the same effort into tackling the crime issues as we do into the positive issues of the internet. As such, the United Kingdom recognised these issues and implemented a national cyber security programme, and this is a cross-government holistic programme that addresses the issue as one UK issue rather than one police agency, one force. It's a UK issue, not even UK government. It's the entire United Kingdom, and how do we make sure what's best for our nation and to try and implement a strategy. We break it down into what we call the 4 Ps, and if you please excuse me, I'll go through those. So we have a pursue strategy, which is probably what most people will recognise is the traditional part of law enforcement, where we will commit to relentlessly pursue, detect, prosecute and disrupt those planning and committing cyber attacks against the United Kingdom. One element in there that some people may not be familiar with is disrupt, in that sometimes we recognise that we can't always prosecute those that are committing offences against the United Kingdom, but we can identify ways to disrupt the criminal business model and to make sure that we remediate the attack if we can. We look to prepare to mitigate cyber attacks by preparing businesses, by preparing our organisations, and we work with our international partners and others to make sure that we prepare to mitigate those attacks. That's why we're here today making those partnerships, while we work strongly with other countries around the world. And similar to the United States and Australia, we have a very extensive international network of officers building up those relationships to prepare the UK to how we can work with our partners. We also look to protect our country. We strengthen that protection against cyber attacks, and that's done in a number of ways. We have a cyber information sharing platform, which is sponsored by the government, but not run by the government. And that's a secure environment where vetted companies can come in, cross-sector, and share information that protects them. There's an awful lot of mention of the financial sector, but many other sectors are equally at risk because they also have information that can be used by criminals to commit crime. So we have a cross-sector platform where people can make sure that all sectors benefit from the information to protect them. We have Action Fraud, which is an online portal where we can encourage people to report information even if they don't wish to report a crime. We recognise that sometimes reported crime is less than the actual reality, but we want to get the best possible picture so we can understand the threat that the United Kingdom faces. So we have a facility that allows people to do that. We also have, newly we support the Cyber Defence Alliance, which is a group of a number of banks, leading banks in the United Kingdom, and there is law enforcement embedded in there to try and make sure that we benefit from the information that the financial sector has at pace and at scale, rather than being in a slow fashion. And we also have our government departments are working proactively to protect the United Kingdom. One of our government departments called CESG, which is part of our national CERT, identified a vulnerability in one of the recent updates from Apple, and they made Apple aware of this vulnerability and to protect the United Kingdom and obviously the rest of the world, because that vulnerability was patched shortly afterwards. We also have what we call a prevent strategy. In many other parts of policing, we've recognized that prosecution isn't always the only strategy that we should have. We should try and stop people becoming criminalized, and that when we talk about cybercrime, we also recognize that sometimes some of our young people end up developing into a cybercrime path when that wasn't their intention in the start, but they had a genuine interest in technology. They got themselves involved in an online group, and they suddenly ended up being a criminal because of what that group collectively had done and the part they'd played in it. So we also have a prevent strategy. We don't want to prosecute our way out of every single issue. We want to make sure that our citizens, if possible, don't get involved in crime in the start. It's much better to prevent than it is to always try and detect. So that's our 4P approach. As part of that, we also, on a policing level, created the National Crime Agency and the National Cybercrime Unit. That's a few hundred strong of dedicated officers with multiple skills, multiple intelligence feeds, and multiple capabilities to try and tackle that cyber threat. When we talk about working with industry in the National Cybercrime Unit, we make sure that working with industry collaboratively is at the absolute heart of every operational outcome, every operation that we do. And that's just not at the enforcement phase. That's not in the middle. That's often at the very, very start of the intelligence development phase. And as my colleague from the United States alluded to, we make sure that's proactive. We don't wait for the crime to happen. We're working proactively to identify threats, to identify trends, and to identify those criminal actors, sometimes 1 or 2 steps above from those that are committing the actual offences, so where we can have the maximum effect with using the information that's available to us. We also have a system of virtual task forces with different industry sectors, allowing them to share information at pace and at scale. So for instance, ISPs and different sectors that outside of the financial sector, where they can share information securely directly into the National Crime Agency and with others to make sure that we can use it. We have a system where we try and look on a national level. We have the National Crime Agency coordinating our approach. We have regional units spread around different parts of the United Kingdom. We have local police forces, and then we've also made sure that we push down cybercrime to individual police officers. All 138,000 police officers in the United Kingdom and all people involved in any form of law enforcement get some element of cybercrime training, and that is increasing. As we've all discussed, and as I'm sure we all know, cybercrime is not new. It's now, in some ways, crime. It's there in every element of society, so we need to make sure that all of our police officers, our first responders, and everybody involved in law enforcement has the ability to recognize and to provide that first response and escalate if required. So an individual police officer can escalate locally, they can escalate regionally, and escalate nationally. And at a national level, we then work with international partners to tackle and remediate that threat. And that's the UK approach that we've taken.
Thank you, Paul. Actually, I was going to ask you the one question, but I think that I would like to keep the 30 minutes for interactions with the audience. So I just hold my question for the later stage. And I would like to ask Mr. Shirai to share the Japanese experience to deal with cybercrime. After then, I would like to open the floor to the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Because we have a state-of-the-art electric appliances here today, so I am quite eager to make use of this, and so let me allow to use this PowerPoints. So first of all, it's a great honor to have an opportunity to introduce our recent measures to combat against threats in cyberspace here today. Let me briefly explain the statistics of cybercrime in Japan. This graph shows the figures of cybercrime cases that were sent to the prosecutor's office by police. As you can see, the number has gradually increased and has become 4 times higher over 10 years. Next is the statistics of online banking fraud. Online banking fraud has become one of the serious cybercrimes that the police has to tackle with. Last year, the amount of damage was about 24 million US dollars, which is 50 times higher compared to the number of 2 years before. Characteristics of the threats this year show that damages are spreading from major banks to medium and small banks. As for cyber attacks, the graph shows the number of spear phishing email attacks that are reported to police. I assume that the number is just the tip of the iceberg compared with the number of actual attacks. However, we can still see the trend from here. During the first half of this year, the number has become approximately sevenfold compared with the same period of the previous year. To counter the escalating threats of cyberspace, the National Police Agency has been modifying its structure and has introduced new strategy and measures just recently. Speaking of our organizational structure, we appointed the first Director General for cybersecurity, namely my boss, actually last year. DG coordinates all the cyber-related activities taken by not only national police, but also local police forces, thus functions as national focal point of cybersecurity. This chart shows the mechanism of how it works. Under Director General, on the left top, we have directors who have cyber responsibilities in the agency. From the left, Director Cybersecurity, which is my position, has policy and planning responsibility. Director Cybercrime takes care of operational matters as well as criminal intelligence. Counter cyber attacks looks after national security matters, including cyber terrorism and espionage. High-tech crime technology deals with digital forensics, malware analysis, and technical assistance. We have approximately 1,000 technical staff here. Director Information Management is responsible for information security. That's national level. And bottom, at local level, the scheme is almost the same in 47 prefectural police forces. They have 5 relevant sections coordinated by general directors who are to report to DG for cybersecurity, National Police Agency. Under DG's direction, we introduced new security strategy just last month. I don't mean to elaborate on this, but just a scheme of security. Our major concept is building a system where human and physical resources will be utilized in a cross-divisional and effective manner. While responding precisely to the change in social conditions, we will enhance capacity to respond to threats in cyberspace, working toward mitigation of actual threats. In line with this strategy, local police forces, such as Tokyo Metropolitan Police and Kyoto Police, have already started to build such systems. For example, prefectural police forces recruited over 900 additional full-time officers for combating against cyber crimes. They had nearly 100 civilians as special investigators who have work-ready knowledge and skills, and the number is increasing. As for human resource development, the Research and Training Center for Cybersecurity, which we opened last year in National Police Academy, is advancing so-called hybrid type initiative, which is to provide officers with hands-on education and training related to cyber knowledge and technique. We are also pushing forward to utilize knowledge from private sectors and currently send approximately 20 officers to cyber-related entities. Regarding capacity enforcement, we have advanced this summer in terms of data retention. Data retention is not regulated in Japan. However, the guideline was amended to show concrete examples of how long internet service providers can retain traffic data as a justifiable act. We cannot encounter the emerging threats of cyberspace only by police. Modeled by the framework of US NCFTA, last November we founded Japan Cybercrime Control Center, JC3 in short, which enables us to share each strengths of private industry, academia, and the police. JC3 is expected to become the focal point of 4 activities in Japan. 1, gathering and analyzing real-time intelligence. 2, providing training. 3, research and development. And 4, partnership with relevant organizations abroad. Under the current transnational threats, international investigative cooperation and capacity building are far more important. Regarding operations, we work with foreign law enforcement agencies, such as FBI, and have carried out takedown operations. Concerning capacity building, as a member of Asian nations, we host seminar and training programs focusing on ASEAN countries. Also, the function of international bodies, such as IGCI and Council of Europe, is indispensable for efficient international cooperation. We strongly support for the efforts of international bodies and continue to commit to global cooperation in this cybersecurity field. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Shirai. I think that's we have covered a variety of issues in the past, actually 60 minutes. I'd like to appreciate the insight and the experience expressed by all the panelists. Thank you so much. Having said that, I'd like to open the floor. Could you mention your name and then the company and the title? Thank you so much. Do you have a mic? Oh, could you? Because of translation, it's better, yeah, for you to have a mic. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. My name is Joseph. Oh, I'll just take
Yes,
that. I don't
mic
wanna
is here.
My name is Joe Hall. I'm from the Center for Democracy and Technology. I'm the CTO there in the U.S. I wanted to ask about mutual legal assistance. The U.S. faces a lot of pressure to perform our mutual legal assistance, specifically because we have a lot of data. Google, Facebook, we have a lot of companies that have a lot of data. There's two things we've been thinking about that I think could be helpful. One is in the case where it's a wholly foreign domestic crime with the victims and the activities happening somewhere else, and all we have is the data. There are some amendments to U.S. laws we could make, this law called ECPA, that would allow that to move a little quicker. The more exciting thing I like to think about is the prospect of what we call parallel investigations. And so to what extent, could law enforcement from different countries say, hey, I have criminals and hey, I have victims, and sort of have a matchmaking service, maybe like a dating service. I hope I'm not speaking too fast for the translators there, that could basically match people up, because in that case you can often avoid much of the slowness that it takes to sort of bootstrap the mutual legal assistance process. And often that's because it's a somewhat adversarial process, and we have certain standards in the US that are much higher than many other countries and some that are much lower. Anyway, I'm just wondering, parallel investigations seem to be pretty promising, and I'm wondering if there are other things we could do to US law that might at least take some of that pressure off of us, and I wonder if others feel different pressures.
Okay, thank you so much for your question. I think the mutual legal assistance treaty is the tools to exchange the information, especially evidence, between the law enforcement across the national borders. In my understanding, I think that the MLAT is not designed to deal with the high volume of the cybercrime investigation. So simply put, it doesn't work so much. It takes a month, and sometimes it takes years. Maybe I think that's Glenn, that you were going to reply to this issue?
I fully agree with you, Nibiru. That's our experience, certainly. And I think your point there, I think that's why we network the networks. I mean, what we see with the IGCI currently and its potential, I mean, it has been effective in taking down some global botnets. I think there was one last year, wasn't it? Simba, was it?
Simba is this April.
And then the EC3 did B-Bone. We've got someone seconded there. We find that a very effective platform. What we'd like to see is, we seem to see there's a proliferation of these centres, and I think that's probably destructive in the long term. I'd rather see the centres we have networked appropriately, and that we do these joint investigations and operations using those to their full potential.
If I can just real quick, I think the other thing too is in the United States we have 56 centers, 56, because not just internationally, we have in our 50 states, we have problems just sharing information state to state because of state law, local law. So I have been a big believer in the centers and the fusion of information and the sharing of information from these centers. I'd rather not see more centers. I'd rather see more integrated centers. Where whatever Japan creates, whatever Australia creates, whatever the US creates, whomever, how do you participate virtually inside of those centers? Because those centers actually bring together an awful lot of intelligence and an awful lot of information to then act on things. If you're just a voyeur of information and you don't have an ability to act, then it's irrelevant, it's meaningless. And I think part of what we've got to do, because I know what you guys are trying to do, and I think it's really important, but it's this idea of how do we virtually participate and how do we virtually connect the centers so we're able to act in a way that's fast, that's at the speed of the cybercrime that's occurring today, which is happening in seconds.
Just to echo my colleagues in that the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty, just to give you an idea of some of the issues, a basic, should we call it a basic cybercrime, you'll have one or more offenders in multiple countries. It will involve a company in a third country. That company will then store its information in a number of different countries. So you're not just doing one Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty request to pursue an investigation, you're often doing dozens to progress an investigation. So I appreciate where you're saying, and I agree with my colleagues, working collaboratively is the only way forward in this. People are doing things programmatically. The Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty request still travels by post. And that's another one of the challenges.
Yeah, just real quick, trust. Trust is a big, big part of what we're talking about here. I think this whole conference is about developing mutual trust. And I think that the only way that we can develop mutual trust is by working together more. And that's a sort of a big, broad statement, but you know, in the world of intelligence, you know, you're taught, you know, you got to be careful who you trust. But actually, that's an old model. That's an old model. In the world that we're operating in and the speed that things are occurring, I have to trust individuals who I don't even know, who I only virtually know. And I think that that's something that we have to overcome. And I think the forums to talk about these kinds of things is where you develop trust and you know, the idea of networking. But virtual networks to solve crimes is what we need. We need to actually figure out how to work those faster and develop trust without having to physically be together. It's a very difficult thing, but it's a model that we're going to have to come to grips with this century.
Yes.
I mean, we can have a lot of trust, and we can have a lot of intelligence sharing and so on. At the end of the day, a judge is unlikely to accept something as evidence unless it has come via mutual legal assistance or through something else established, another procedure established by law. Let's face it, that's it. And we have to find a solution to that. We have to create a legal framework where certain type of information, like subscriber information, should normally have a much lesser level of protection than traffic data and content. So can we, at least for subscriber information, find international solutions where we can have more or less an instant access to such data and so on. Again, it has to be established by law. We need a legal framework for that and so on, so that a judge that has a case where the who did it is established through subscriber information, can accept it. This is one thing. Another thing is about joint investigations or parallel investigations is fine. I think this is done all the time already. But you have to understand the frustration that an Italian prosecutor told me recently. He has 2 suspects, Gmail users. He has a local court order for interception of a communication. There is no relation whatsoever. Both suspects are in Italy. There's no relation whatsoever to the US, except that somebody at Google has to make a technical manipulation on a server there for the interception. Why does this have to go through mutual legal assistance? And then why interception, probable cause, and all these things in the US? It's an obstacle, it's a hurdle that can never be met in such a case. There is no link to the US to convince a judge in the US this is of relevance to us. So we have to look at that sort of situation. This morning it was fantastic to talk about machine-to-machine learning, artificial intelligence, and so on. At the same time, justice functions based on the Lotus ruling of 1927. Justice is basically still in Jurassic Park in many ways. And how can we bring them into the 21st century? I think that's a challenge.
Thank you so much. Maybe I think we can ask the other opinions from the floor. Yes, please.
I'm Yoshi Hori of Globis. I have a question to General Frey. You mentioned about there's data has been taken as hostages, and you said $50,000 are generally charged. Who are actually doing committing that kind of crimes? And that's one question. The second is you mentioned about $3 trillion are engaged somehow in cyber crimes. That seems like awful a lot of money. And how, like, could you please elaborate on that?
Yeah. So what's happening is that the request for the data, they're asking, and you actually go to the site and you click on, the payment. So they're finding these things. The challenge is attributing and then hunting that individual down who's actually doing that, and they're likely to be in another country. So this and the $50,000 is the average fee. Some cases it's only a few $100s. In some cases it's as much as $1 million. So data being taken hostage like human beings were taken hostage in the past. Okay, it's fascinating because and the payment in Bitcoin right now is operating at about $70 billion globally. About $70 billion Bitcoin on the internet right now. So this is it's a relatively new phenomenon within the last couple of years, and I know that we're dealing with it, and we're trying to figure out is it criminal groups, or is it individuals or whatever. So now on the 3 trillion, that's the total cost. It actually goes from about 600 billion to about 3 trillion as the high, for the total cost of what cyber activities are causing the world to have to protect itself, to defend against it, to train people. So it's a total cost that's occurring globally. So
I think that estimation is made by Symantec. I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, and you saw just in what my friend, my colleague from Japan talked about, and he showed the significant growth in cost, or the exponential growth in cost. Those are what's known. That's what's known. There's a lot of things that aren't known, and that was just in crime. So if you look at all the other things that we're facing, I mean, I can tell you, from our defense side, from the military intelligence side, what we know about nation states and the theft of intellectual capital of major weapon systems, multi-billion-dollar weapon systems, being the intellectual theft, the blueprints, the architecture of those weapon systems, where we spend 10 or 15 years developing them and they're stolen overnight. That's a huge, huge cost. So it's the whole, but yeah, that's.
Thank you so much. I think we have one question from there. Do you have a mic?
Thank you very much. I'm Javed Ahmad Bakhtash from Rikis University, and I'm from Afghanistan. I have a question. I heard about developing countries, but I want to have a question regarding third countries like Afghanistan and other South Asian countries or African countries. So there, people are using like piracy softwares or malicious softwares as well, and there is no network security and cryptography at all. So what is your advice for those governments that they are using the technology newly, and how they can, for example, crypt all the networks or big data that they have? Please, I need some advice from your side. Thank you very much.
Maybe I think this is related to the awareness raising of the, authentic actually use of the tools and the software. Maybe I think that it's anyone who is.
This is all about like third countries, maybe South Asian countries, like African countries, those countries that people are using like piracy softwares, and there is no any law and regulation for this. So, thank you.
Well, from Australia's perspective, we are supporting Southeast Asian countries through ASEAN, and we're doing the capacity development. We obviously see you're only strong as your weakest link, so we need to support third countries, and I think this is where, back to you, Nibiru, I think Interpol has a critical role in capacity development. I understand you do some work in Africa, but I think it's certainly a role that I think IGCI and more broadly Interpol should take on as well.
Yeah, I think that's a matter of the capacity building. Maybe I think the Council of Europe has some role to play in this one.
Yeah, I think the issue of pirate software, and it's one of many other measures. I mean, we are not, as Council of Europe, dealing with that, but we're dealing with laws, and we have been supporting actually Afghanistan in the draft together with the United States Department of Justice in the drafting of a law. I think this exercise is still going on. And after that, I'm sure we can also do other capacity building activities with Africa. We do this all the time. We have, this coming week, we have an event for ASEAN countries in Manila. So we do this capacity building things all the time. As Council of Europe, we're not getting involved in software and licenses. But again, that is just one of many other things.
Okay, just real quick, because the underdeveloped nations of the world, or those that are still developing, like Afghanistan, this is where the international, westernized, developed world has to step up our game. And so, one, I applaud the fact that you're here. I think that that's huge. But I think that there's countries that can't. They actually can't do it right now. Like I can name 50 of them that cannot do what we're talking about. And so what we have to do, and so the criminals know exactly, they know that, because you are one of the weakest links, let's just say, not you Afghanistan, but you, those 50 countries, weakest link. And that's where the criminal operates. He operates against the weakest link. And same with nation states. So we have a responsibility as a developed world to help you, whether we like it or not, whatever it costs. Security is costly. And it's uncomfortable, but we have a responsibility to do that, and that's why I think that this, it's these kinds of things. But then you got to take a message back, and and you got to be courageous to continue to kind of get this message back to your country, as others do throughout Africa and other parts of the world.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'd like to revisit the issue of the information sharing platform, because you mentioned that, General Flynn, we shouldn't be solely dependent on the human relationship. I think that we need to institutionalize the personal trust for the institutional usage. So I think that's any information sharing requires a legal background, legal framework. And then what kind of the legal framework would be necessary? It depends on the purpose, objective of information sharing. Intelligence purpose, clearly no, but I think investigative purpose, yes, we need to do it. We need to have the rigorous data privacy issues, etc. So I'd like to ask you, the currently, what kind of mechanism would be the widely acknowledged as, let's say, rational way of information sharing, to back up the national legislation or regional initiative like a EU directive? So do you have some comments? Maybe I think that Paul?
Just to make the distinction between criminal intelligence and nation-state intelligence.
Yeah, you need to differentiate. Yeah, of course.
The process we try and take in the United Kingdom is more a case of, is there a reason why we can't share it? It's to try and look at every piece of information that could potentially impact upon a threat, to try and see, is there a legal reason why we can't share it? And if there isn't, then let's get that information to the people that can use it to try and have an impact upon the criminal threat. So in some ways we try and turn the paradigm upside down and look at it from a different perspective. Is there a reason why we can't, rather than what are the institutions in place that enable us to do so?
I guess that the UK has different channels to information, to share information with different stakeholders. Once again, depending on the purpose of the information which you are going to use in your countries. For instance, Five Eyes are mentioned by General as friend. It's a 20th century's way of information sharing. What exactly are you doing in terms of information sharing? Let's say the cyber threat information in the context of law enforcement. It's not national security.
In the context of law enforcement, we're working with IGCI. We have somebody based there.
It's you.
It's me. We have people based in EC3, and we have people based in other centres around the world. And again, we look to try and make sure that we pass information. Within the last few weeks, I can think of information that's IGCI facilitated that's come from the United Kingdom and been passed out to countries to try and tackle criminal threats in those countries. And what we will look to see is it might not be information that's sufficient to initiate a criminal case, but it's sufficient information to inform the receiving country about a criminal threat that they can then decide what's best within their jurisdiction, what's best within their sovereign powers to try and negate that criminal threat. In the United Kingdom, I can't be conversant with every single person's legislation around the world, every single country, But what I can do is try and provide them an opportunity and a chance to use the information I have to try and tackle those threats within their own legislative structures.
Thanks so much. When it comes to the investigation, I think that there will be more and more chances where you see the information is not in your countries, outside your country, because of the cloud services, which was mentioned this morning and in this panel. But some people strongly insist that data localization would be the solution for law enforcement to get the information just with the national court order. What do you think about this kind of the data localization? I think some countries already implement. If you want to actually do business in my countries, all data related to our nationals should be stored in our territory. Unless otherwise, you are not able to do business. This discussion is ongoing globally. What do you think about this one?
I think from many perspectives, also from legal perspective, it's not actually the location of data that is decided, but the location of the data controller. Let me give you one example that we are discussing repeatedly, and maybe it's hearsay, but apparently it's true. Facebook has a huge data center somewhere in the north of Sweden called Luleå. So you may have now a prosecutor in Luleå who sees from his office, or a police officer who sees the data center, let's say. That prosecutor would have to send a request respecting Irish law to the US to possibly get the data. So the fact that he or she can see the data center has zero impact there. So we have to think about, that's why some of these models are completely absurd. But we have to get some legal clarity of it to be clear. And I think also different types of service provider, internet industry, they also want to have this legal certainty to know under what rules they should operate.
I think that's very interesting perspective, because I think that's most of the times the cloud service providers are global the service provider, which is actually the non-state actor in good meaning. They are not the ISIS, Islamic State type of things, but I think actually the non-state actors. So non-state actors are playing the key role in terms of the cyber. So what do you think there is some mechanism to engage global actually non-state actors especially in this time at a good meaning?
The international law of the high seas, which goes back hundreds of years actually, and it's been developed over the centuries, is actually an interesting model to think about for international law for cyber. There's a reason why when two ships pass each other at sea, you have to pass on the right, as an example. That's been developed over time. It's not a perfect model by any stretch, but we have to use certain legal, internationally accepted models that do exist, and then take the best parts of them. There's developments going on in space where cyber is conducted from or against, and space has internationally accepted laws to be able to operate in space for those countries that do that. And it's a fascinating model, and it's one that has laws involved in it and behaviors involved in it, so it's something that we have to think about. I just think in terms of the information sharing models, we have to, from the intelligence side, I think the law enforcement community, global law enforcement community, actually is starting to shine a light on the importance of these large multilateral sharing agreements that we need to put in place. And I think the Five Eyes model, which was based on national security, is old.
Thank you so much. Any input from the audience? Information sharing model? No? Actually, the one point which was not mentioned in this session, but I think mentioned in the morning session, that is actually encryption and then privacy. It's just a matter of attribution versus privacy. I think that this is very much important, because I think last year Apple started the new way of communication, new way of encryption. That was quite annoying for law enforcement to decrypt the data as possessed by the criminals. I think once again, actually the non-state actors, and once again, it's a good meaning. The global leaders have the stand setter. They are going to set the standard for the many communication. Yeah, I think that they. I said, could you share your view on this?
So very technical, but encrypted security at what's called the 256 AES level. Okay, so I'm going to be a little bit technical. That is affordable today. It's very affordable, and criminal organizations already have it. And so it affects not only our ability to protect our own sovereignty as a national security issue, but for high crime that's going on out there. 256 encrypted capability, communications, voice, video, and data is going to be the norm here within the next probably year to two. It already is starting to come in very rapidly. And it will shut down all of the organizations that are up here that are representing intelligence or law enforcement's ability to be able to go after criminals. It will shut us down. And so now what we're talking about, because it was talked about in here about back doors. And nobody wants a back door because everybody thinks, well, the U.S. is going to be listening to you. But I'm telling you, the back doors are going away because of the development of technology. And there's already, for those that understand the technical stuff, there's already developments in the 512 level, 512 of security encryption, okay, which is twice what 256 is. So that'll be here probably within 5 years. So this is going to have an enormous challenge for national security and for law enforcement and definitely for intelligence. And not even the ISPs can help you.
Thank you so much. I think that the industry has their own effort to make, and then actually the second session in the afternoon is going to discuss industry effort to combat cybercrime. So I hope that this issue will be touched upon in the subsequent session. But I would like to wrap up in a way that the law enforcement have made great effort to tackle the cybercrime. And then the Five Eyes models are now not 21st century model. It looks like a 20th century model. We need a new mechanism to share information. But I think that the information sharing model needs clear actually the legislative framework, which is acceptable to the nations who are participating in the information sharing platform. I believe that the international organization like Interpol will be playing the key role in the future, I hope. But at the same time, I think that's the nation states continue to have the big role to protect citizens, regardless where they are online or on the street. Maybe I think that's the different layers of the cooperation mechanism, especially in the context of information sharing, need to be redeveloped, having in mind the security and also the data protection and the privacy. I think the very complex issues which we need to bear in mind, but I think that's the collaborative approach to discuss this issue will be leading to the solutions down the road in the future, I believe. So I'd like to thank to all of the panelists and the speakers for once again your great insight and then dedication. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.